2022 meeting of the Finance Committee for the town of Shrewsbury. Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Mark Adler, Chair of the committee. To confirm that all committee members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me, please respond in the affirmative when I call your name. Judy Vetter.
Here.
Lena Polito. Lena, are you there?
I can see she's on.
That's who she's on.
Yep.
Is your mic muted, Lena?
Yes, it is.
Okay, I'll assume she's diverted. I'll come back to her. Dennis O'Connell? I don't see him on. Hannah Kane, I believe, was going to be absent. She already informed me of that. Alan Jarrell, are you there? I don't see Alan on the list. Hey, Lena, are you there? Lena Polito, I just saw that you joined. I'm hoping that brings you in. Get back to that.
Lena, you need to unmute your mic.
Yeah, she might be having some technical problems because it looks like she went off and went back on again. So we'll see. Let's see, who's next? Carlos Garcia.
I'm here.
Hey, Carlos.
Hello.
Rajiv Dayal.
Here.
Vikram Chabra.
I am here.
And let me just go back over who we missed. If Lena's here, just chime in when you can. Just tell us that you're here. And Alan Jarrell, are you there?
Present.
Hey, great. Okay, from the town manager's office, Kevin Mizikar.
Present.
Alexandria Martinez. Alexandria Martinez, are you there?
Present.
Hey, there you are. From the school department, Joseph Sawyer.
Present.
And Patrick Collins.
Here.
And from the school committee, John Wensky.
Present.
Jason Palich.
Present.
Dale McGee.
Present.
Lindsay Heffernan.
Present.
And Sandra Fritz.
Present.
Is there anyone else from the finance committee who I didn't get a chance to chime in who wants to let us know that they're there?
I am here. Sorry, struggling to unmute myself.
Hey, that's fine. We've all been there. Okay, so I think we're ready to go. Let me do the preliminaries. This open meeting will be conducted by remote participation to the greatest extent possible, consistent with Senate Bill 2475 enacted June 16, 2021, which allows public bodies to meet remotely, so long as reasonable public access is afforded so the public can follow the deliberations of the meeting. For this meeting, the Finance Committee is convening by Google Meet, as posted on the town's website, identifying how the public may join. Please mute your devices unless called upon to speak. The meeting will not feature public comment. Each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. And now before I begin, I just saw that Dennis O'Connell joined. Are you there, Dennis? And can you hear us? You were here. You unmute and tell us that you're here, or just let us know when you join us, just to know that you're here.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, all right.
Okay.
All right, so let's begin. We'll go to our agenda. We did the call to order. Next is considering the minutes of December 16th, 2021. Is there any discussion of those minutes or any motions relative thereto?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Dennis has a motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
Someone second. I can't see everyone, but I'm sure it was a wise second. Is there any further discussion? All in favor? Signify by saying aye when I call your name. Judy Vetter,
Aye.
Lena Polito,
Aye.
Dennis O'Connell,
Aye.
Alan Jarrell,
Aye.
Carlos Garcia,
Aye.
Rajiv Dayal,
Aye.
Vikram Chabra,
Aye.
and I will also say aye. Motion carries. Minutes are approved. Next, report of the town manager, Mr. Mizikar. Go ahead.
Good evening, members of the Finance Committee, School Committee, and Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins. Pleasure to be with you this evening. I wanted to provide everyone an update on local receipts at the halfway mark of the fiscal year. I'm very pleased to provide the information. It's in the committee's drive. Thus far, we've collected almost $100,000 more in the first 6 months of this fiscal year than we did last fiscal year. Of course, by the end of last fiscal year, we were very pleased that we came in markedly over the budget of $13.1 million in receipts, and I'm pleased that we're on similar pace for the first 6 months comparatively. Of course, our largest local receipt is the motor vehicle excise tax, which we don't bill out the vast majority of until the month of February. But everything else looks really strong again. We were worried about a decline year over year in the licenses and permits, which is driven by the economic activity, investments in buildings, homes, and things like that. That's one of the strongest categories, at least comparing it to the budget. We may not mirror last year's number, but we've collected 90% of what we budgeted for halfway through the year. And then from a general economic standpoint, I'm very pleased to point out that the hotel excise tax is already at 100% of what we budgeted, even though we're only halfway through the year. And the meals tax is at nearly 80% of what we budgeted. So, of course, we put these figures together last year around this time, and as we went into the spring months before town meeting with a lot of uncertainty. So we're still very conservative in our estimates, but it's really good to see the strong returns that we've received so far. So this is something that we'll keep the committee posted on throughout the course of the budget process until we get up to town meeting. Thus far, we've collected $3,758,595.72. That's about 35% of our total budget estimate. Again, motor vehicle excise tax will really start to come in the months of February and March. So happy to answer any questions that you may have, and pleased to provide this report. Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? Just politely say so. I don't have to call on you. All right. Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything else, Kevin, to present to us tonight?
I will just note that we are still reviewing departmental budget submissions. We're on track to be able to provide the committee and publish fiscal projection 1 near the end of the second week in February, and we'll get that out to you as soon as possible. This year, it's going to come as a part of our new digital budget book through ClearGov, which is the software package that we've been using over the past few years. Alex Martinez has the lead in developing that right now, so we're starting to assemble the narrative, and we'll finalize the numbers and get that out to the committee in a few weeks from now. So look forward to sending that and working with you throughout the rest of the process.
Thank you, Kevin and Alex, for the work on ClearGov. When that was introduced, it must have been about a year and a half ago, was it? 2 years ago? It's just been a fantastic resource and a great way for not just the Finance Committee and other town leaders to access, but the public as well. So as we're going along, it's great to always note that that's what we're using and where the public can access resources and learn more about it. Links to it from the town website and so forth. So it's a new way of doing this process, and it's wonderful. So thank you very much for the work that you guys have done on it. Right, moving along. We're going to move straight to our, on the agenda we have it written as a joint meeting with the school committee for a workshop on school finances. Let me just explain to the public. Earlier this fiscal year, we started conducting here on the Finance Committee elementary style workshops on a variety of topics at our monthly meetings. We invite department heads to give an overview presentation during which the Finance Committee members and others in attendance can ask questions. These are general topic workshops without the usual detailed discussions that we might have at our regular budget hearings. We are trying to keep these brief, perhaps under 30 minutes, and also informal, with everyone being able to ask questions or very politely interrupt without having to be formally called on and go through the motions in the process. We started with a workshop a couple months ago on OPEB, and then last month we were talking about town accounting, and this month we are getting to the nitty-gritty of how school finances and school budgets work. This is a general overview. We'll be dealing with the prospective budget and long-term budgeting questions in future meetings. So without further ado, I hand it over to the Superintendent of Schools, Joe Sawyer, and the Assistant Superintendent for Finance, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Adler. And I think it would be terrific if Mr. Wensky, as the chair of the committee, can give a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll be providing some of the information that you asked for. So turn it over to Mr. Wensky.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, Finance Committee members. Appreciate you having us for tonight's meeting. As Joe mentioned, I'm John Wensky. I'm Chair of the School Committee. I'm joined tonight by my colleagues, Vice Chair Sandy Fritz, Secretary Lindsay Heffernan, and members Dr. Dale McGee and Jason Palich, as you mentioned, along with Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Patrick Collins, who is our Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations. So it's a new year, and it's a very new budget development cycle for Shrewsbury Public Schools, as you can imagine, as a result of the community support, certainly of the May 4th operational override. Those guideposts for developing a school budget in Shrewsbury have changed significantly in a positive way. Certainly, so under the approved override framework, we have a new level of financial stability and predictability, which is certainly a welcome change from any school budget cycle, I think, that we've experienced in the last 2 decades. So during tonight's presentation, Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins will provide you with an overview of that school department budget development process and the major cost categories, along with the sources of funding associated with that budget. So with that, hand it over to Dr. Sawyer and Mr. Collins.
Thank you. And if Mr. Collins could share the slide deck, and I believe if it's some of the slides may be more difficult, I know that Ms. Martinez sent along the deck to the Finance Committee earlier today, I believe. So we'll get that up on screen, and then we will proceed.
Okay, here we go.
Thank you. And just so that way we can keep it within our guidelines for the time frame involved, if we can just keep it to the general process of how school department budgeting works and education financing, and I don't want to jump the gun too much on the present budget and present issues just yet. Thank you.
Understood. And Mr. Collins, if you could go ahead and play that slideshow so we can blow this up a little bit.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
All right. It's full on my screen here, so.
Okay. So we'll go ahead and just proceed. The essentially, the introduction, if you can move to the next slide, we'll cover a few topics briefly this evening. Are you able to advance that, Patrick, or not?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought it's advancing on my screen here.
Okay, there you go. That moved it.
Okay.
So we'll talk about some guideposts. We'll talk about some major cost categories and the method that we use, which is the request of us tonight. Talk a little bit about enrollment forecasting, the sources of the different funds, which is always of interest to people, and just a little bit about letting people know about the way their duties and internal controls are handled. The next slide is just a reminder that every year when we develop our budget, we're looking back to our overall vision as a school district and our strategic goals. Back in 2017, the school committee approved, after a year-long study group, put together what's known as the Portrait of a Shrewsbury Graduate, which is essentially a document that illustrates the kind of skills and knowledge and dispositions that we're trying to develop in our students over the course of their time in the Shrewsbury Public Schools, from preschool all the way through high school. And at the same time, the district used that as a springboard to develop its next 5-year set of strategic priorities. Those strategic priorities, not in any particular order, were very frankly helpful, because when the pandemic hit in the middle of this 5-year cycle, some of those things were areas that we were already paying attention to. One good example of that is that we were under the category of connected learning for a complex world. A lot of ambitious technology goals. They weren't nearly as ambitious of what we ended up having to do to launch remote learning as a result of the pandemic and hybrid learning. But we were well positioned, in better position than a lot of other school districts because of the work we were already doing. Along the same lines, enhanced well-being of all, we were focusing on higher rates of student mental health issues and behavioral and health even prior to the pandemic, and that's only amplified it. So we actually had a meeting today of our administrative team, and one of the things we were looking at was, which strategic priorities are we looking to advance in this next budget cycle? So even the conversations that we have are always connected to what we're trying to do. They're very mission and goal driven. At this point, I'll turn it over to Mr. Collins, who can talk a little bit about the budget development piece for next year. This is kind of an initial framework, then we'll talk more about the general ideas of how we go through that.
Thank you, Dr. Sawyer. So again, I know that this presentation is focused on the how-to in terms of budget development. This is the only slide that references fiscal 23, but I thought it would be of interest to this group since we're under this new compact post override. So basically, you see some calculations there that take the current year budget of $75.7 million on the left-hand box and apply the 4.25% maximum agreed upon increase on an annual basis, and that provides another $3.2 million for fiscal 23. And then per the agreement also, I know Mr. Mizikar has already made his updated revenue projection. And so we know based upon the prior agreement that the additional revenue split basically would provide about $250,000 more. So of course, this is subject to change as we go through the process and really kind of begins in a more formal public way next month. But this is kind of baseline what we're looking forward to for fiscal 23 is a budget that's just under $79.2 million or a 4.5% increase, again, with a caveat that could be subject to a little bit of change once everything gets officially launched. So that's kind of the look ahead, and Dr. Sawyer will be making his initial recommendation for fiscal 23 budget on February 16th. This next slide basically talks to the issue that the school department is fueled by many different sources of funds. We all know that we come together, in the springtime, especially to talk about the town appropriated budget, which is on the top row here, highlighted in blue. And that's the budget that we bring to town meeting. But in addition to that, there are many other sources of funds like grant money, state reimbursements, private donations, tuition and fees that get assessed to families that help fuel the operation of the budget. And so you can see there that, planned for fiscal 22, the year that we're in right now, that those additional revenue sources would be in the neighborhood of 9.7 million. And you can see the trend prior to that was higher, of course. And, we're looking this year for some of those decreases to be, in the food service program, for example, and in other local receipts where we had charged previously full day kindergarten. So again, the point to this slide is many different sources of funds. And then in the lower half of this is we do annually have to report all of our expenses and revenues to the state, just like every other school district. And there are many other budgets, town budgets, that fuel our operations. And so in the aggregate, that's $25 million of additional funding. And those are things like health insurance, the town share of the health insurance for school employees, pension costs, debt service for school projects, public building staff, custodial, all of those things get added up, if you will, and included in our kind of total cost per pupil factor when those statistics are published. So again, multiple sources of funds, putting together a school budget on an annual basis. I'm going to talk more specifically now about the town appropriation. This is the area that's the largest portion of all the funding, and of course, the one that is subject to town meeting of approval, unlike those other sources of funds, which are not subject to town meeting approval, and they're at the disposal of the school committee without any other appropriating activity. So this pie chart basically takes the current fiscal year, $75 million, and breaks it into really big chunks. And you can see that salaries and wages, of course, 82%, almost $62 million. I'm going to drill down a little bit about how we put these budgets together. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but transportation is the next, special ed tuitions is the next biggest category, and transportation, and some of the other categories account for 1%, 2%, or 3%. So you can see that the lion's share of our operation, of course, is spent on personnel. Personnel is job one, and teachers and paraprofessionals and administrative support people, IT people are what fuel the education business. So a little bit more specifically, when we're putting together a budget, we have labor groups and we have non-labor groups. And so our salary budgets are guided by those labor contracts and the agreed upon labor rate salaries and wages. We have 3 unions: teachers, counselors, and nurses. Our assistant principals are a bargaining unit unto themselves. And then our paraprofessionals are a group as well. And I should have put here as well, our cafeteria staff is also another labor group. And that whole operation has traditionally been self-funded as well. Non-union labor groups are all the clerical, administrative, instructional, technology support folks, and administrators are non-union. This is our staffing. Just to break out by kind of major category: administrators, clerical support, and by school. It's an FTE basis, 892 FTE. And I think it's important to note here that, our town appropriation has just over 1,600 different discrete accounts that account for the entire appropriation. And what we do every year is we take a look at our staffing, every single individual, and we project forward their annual salary based upon a labor contract or what we believe is going to be a non-union wage increase, and redo that every year from ground zero. So what we don't do is maybe like some other organizations, is they might just take a salary account, if you will, with a group of people and apply some sort of factor to it for the next year, which is a less precise way of doing it. So we have a very precise, it's very labor intensive to do this, but it's the most accurate and most precise way to do that. So that's how we're putting together all of our salary and wage budgets, again, which account for 82% of our overall town appropriation. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sawyer to talk about out-of-district special ed tuitions.
Thanks, Mr. Collins. This is an area, and those of you who have been on the Finance Committee for some time know that it is certainly one of the more volatile areas year to year because there's the potential for big cost swings, really depending on if a student ends up qualifying for one of these out-of-district placements or student moves into the community at some point that requires an out-of-district placement. There's a wide range of costs associated with this. We're responsible for educating students who have special learning needs from the time they turn age 3 until they turn age 22. There's a small percentage of the students whom we serve who we are not able to educate in our own school district because they require such highly specialized services due to the nature of their disability. You can see in the last bullet there, we have, this current year's budget, we have 70 students for tuitions, and that ranges from $54,000, which would be a day placement, students living at home in Shrewsbury being transported to a day program, to $454,000 for a student in a very intensive residential program full year. So it's a wide range, and you can see why that cost category it can be create pressure depending on what's happening with that group of students year over year. The next slide refers to the circuit breaker program, and we've had a conversation with this in the past with the Finance Committee. There is a state reimbursement program based on reimbursing essentially a cost beyond a certain threshold that's paid locally. A certain amount of money beyond that threshold is shared between the state and the local community. And that typically by law it's a maximum of 75% paid by the state of the money above that threshold and 25% by the district. That can vary year over year depending on the ultimate budget set by the legislature. But you can see the example there at the bottom. This is the reimbursement lags 1 year, so we're being reimbursed this year by the state for our qualified expenses in this category last year. You can see the example there, $7 million in total tuitions in this year's budget. We're offsetting that with close to $3 million of circuit breaker reimbursement, which is why the bottom line on our budget is $4.1 million. Next slide will shift to another out-of-district tuition, this having to do with vocational technical high school tuition. This tuition rate is set through the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Our students traditionally over time have gone to Aspet Valley Technical High School. This year's rate is $17,000, a little bit more than that. And this year we budgeted for 121 students for just over $2 million. We had an extensive report and conversation recently with the school committee because of a state policy change about admitting students to vocational technical high schools. Communities like Shrewsbury, who do not belong to a vocational technical high school regional district as a member community, our students are considered out-of-district students who are tuitioned in to the tech school. And the state level policy change has to do with requiring the regional districts to offer seats to their own member community students first, and reducing the ability for the school to put admissions criteria into place. And as a result of that, for our situation with Assabet, it's quite possible that we will have very few, if any, ninth graders accepted to Assabet next year because the demand is likely to be so high from its member communities. We have communicated to our eighth grade families that they should still, if they're interested, apply. There's the potential to get off a wait list at some point through their lottery. We also suggested, we looked at other local regional tech schools within driving distance, and we suggested they may be interested in applying to the Tri-County High School in Franklin, Massachusetts, and because they're potentially going to have some seats for out-of-district students. Most of the schools we contacted within reasonable driving distance do not anticipate they'll have extra seats. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Mr. Collins to talk about transportation within the district.
Okay, school transportation services, again, relatively large piece of that pie after salaries. And right now, we are in the fourth year of a 5-year contract with AA Transportation. Of course, we outsource the transportation services to a private company. And our contract right now for the current year is just over $436 per day per bus, or about $78,000 a year for each yellow bus. We have 48 yellow buses under contract for home to school transportation. And our rate increase this year was 2.9% over the prior year. And just for informational purposes, the rate is set already for fiscal 23 by contract, and that's at 2.8%. So we're in a fairly fortunate position to be protected, even though we're in a high inflation environment with that particular area of our budget for next year. Out of district transportation, transporting those students Dr. Sawyer referenced earlier, is provided by a different company called Vanpool. And we are kind of a third party to a contract through our educational collaborative, who coordinates all of those services in that contract on behalf of the 11 member towns in the Assabet Valley Collaborative. So the benefit of that, for example, is if we have students who are going to the New England Center for Children, for example, in Southborough, and who attend there on a day placement, and for example, say Westboro has a student and Northborough has a student, then that van would pick up the Shrewsbury student first and then go to Northborough and then Westboro and then drive to New England Center for Children. So we get the benefit of, scaling and ride sharing, if you will, and reducing our cost per student for that service. We are required to, like any other public school district, provide transportation to Shrewsbury students who are attending private schools, DOE approved private schools in Shrewsbury. So we are transporting under our contract students to St. John's, St. Mary's, Alhambra, Montessori. And that's under the same terms as our Shrewsbury students. So if there were to be required to pay a fee, then the private school students have to pay a fee as well. This is a breakout of the transportation cost, different types of transportation. I just talked about the top row there. Pupil transportation regular day, that's kind of home to school. You can see there that the total cost, when you kind of factor the daily rate times the number of buses per year, we have an offset for the expected revenue for the bus fee that parents will be paying. So for this year, I budgeted $470,000. And so that net amount of $2.5 million is what gets incorporated into the town appropriation budget for the Maytown for this past Maytown meeting. In addition, we're required to, as needed, provide transportation to homeless students, foster care students. We run 3 buses on a daily basis from Shrewsbury to Assabet Valley Vocational Technical High School for those students. We have some student activity transportation for the high school primarily, and then athletic transportation runs, we budget $150,000. Below that is special ed transportation. We run typically 6 buses in the summertime, and then 7 buses during the school year, and then bus monitoring services. So that's more the details of how kind of the aggregates, how you get to $4.3 million is we provide a range of transportation services, more than just the yellow bus picking up somebody's child at the end of the street. It's a variety of services. Then to kind of close out this part is, collectively, like any other budget, we have all types of smaller line items for contractual services, like special education contractors, repairs and maintenance of equipment, legal services, graduation expenses, software application. Those are all contractual services. That's $1.4 million. Of course, for a school, buying textbooks and technology, it's $1.1 million. And then some of the just other miscellaneous expenses like postage, supplies, athletic supplies, office supplies, custodial supplies, telephone expenses, that's $853,000. So again, collectively, a lot of different line items, but kind of a smaller portion collectively of our budget. Just kind of moving on to enrollment, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Sawyer.
Sure, and just to touch briefly, this illustration indicates we rank in the top 9% in the state for school districts in terms of enrollment. We're a large district for Massachusetts, so we're 27th out of 314 different school districts in terms of enrollment, and that's something that in some places gives us some economy of scale. In other ways, it makes it more difficult to manage sometimes than a smaller district might be. Each year we do forecasting of enrollment. We use 2 different enrollment projections, one from the town manager's office and one from an outside organization called NESDEC. We focus on the class size guidelines that are established by school committee policy, which you can see there as well. The next slide, you'll see the enrollment history. We, like many other school districts across the nation, have experienced an enrollment dip due to the pandemic. And we do not know all the reasons why for that. Some of it, we believe, there's a bit of an uptick in homeschooling, not enough to create that much of a decrease. We believe there's some families who are holding their youngest students out of school, waiting an extra year before they start them in preschool or kindergarten, because those levels definitely had come under our projections. And it remains to be seen whether, as the pandemic hopefully is coming to a close over time, those numbers start to move back up to where they were previous.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to shift this presentation from talking about how we're developing the expense budget and what goes into that, and kind of the mechanical pieces, which we just outlined, and shifting now to, okay, so where does this money come from to support all those expenses? And as I mentioned before, there are multiple sources, and the town appropriation, of course, is the largest. This bar chart shows the history of the town appropriation. And in yellow, of course, right now we're at 75.
Hold on a second, Patrick. Rajiv, did you have something you wanted to say, Rajiv?
Yes, I just had a question here. I mean, there are so many line items in the budget, and frankly, it was the first time I'm looking at a school budget. If one was to look at this in terms of a kind of a common benchmark, I mean, like, is it a cost per student would be a good benchmark? And whatever the benchmark is, how do we compare to other school districts?
Sure, I can start there with an answer. Yeah, in terms of benchmarking, costs, if you will, that there is a standard statistic that is used universally throughout the state per pupil expenditure. And we are, traditionally have run, pretty significantly under the state average for per pupil expenditure. I'm just trying to look in our budget book right now to tell you exactly what that is. But that information and all those statistics are provided annually by the Department of Education. And it's based upon all school district reporting. So, for example, in fiscal 20, which is the latest data that's produced, the state average per pupil cost was $17,511, and Shrewsbury was at $14,499. So fairly significantly under. And then we have other charts in our budget book that compare us to our surrounding communities regionally, and then also other communities that are like us based upon socioeconomics. And again, we tended to fall on the lower end of all those scales. So that's in terms of benchmarking, costs, which is one aspect of the educational enterprise. Of course, we do not use any of that information to put together budgets. And there are of course, not more important, but other important factors about benchmarking around student performance. I'm not sure if Dr. Sawyer wants to touch upon that topic or not.
Well, I think that what Mr. Collins mentioned is an important economic benchmark, of course, in terms of our expenditures. To give a little bit of context, just roughly the difference between the state average and the average that we've been spending as a district up until this point. It's roughly $3,000+ per student. You multiply that by the 5,800 students we have, that's about $17.4 million that we're spending below the average school district. So if we were an average school district in Massachusetts, our budget would be about $17.4 million larger. All the expenses that go into it, Mr. Collins said, town expenses, school department expenses, everything that goes into the educational enterprise. In terms of, I'm happy to speak later after we get through the presentation relative to if there are questions about some of the educational benchmarking. But we've traditionally been quite strong in that area as well.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that my kind of message here about this town appropriation is basically it's comprised of kind of two basic components that are typically known in the educational jargon as Chapter 78 and local contribution. Local contribution being tax revenue that's raised every year. And the Chapter 78 refers to the general law, Mass General Law, Chapter 70, that provides a school finance formula to share in the cost of providing educational services to all students across Massachusetts. And they do that in a way to normalize for socioeconomic conditions across the Commonwealth. So just very generally, if you're the concept is if you're a very wealthy community, you would get less state aid. And if you were a more needy, economically needy community, you would get more state aid per pupil. So that Chapter 78 is, published. It will be published in a couple of weeks, actually, or actually next week for the upcoming school year based upon the governor's budget. And I know Mr. Mizikar uses that in his revenue forecast for the upcoming year. We don't, I don't use that in terms of my school budget because that's a general fund receipt. Those monies go direct to the town and are subject to, annual appropriation. So that's the major sources of funding. Here's a little bit more on state aid. How much do we get? So in the green bar is kind of the so-called base aid. And then for each of these years, the incremental increase is shown in red. So for example, for fiscal 22, we are getting the sum of $20 million base aid from the prior year, fiscal 21, plus the increase in aid, which was $30 per pupil, which is the minimum amount of increase that school districts will get going forward under the Student Opportunity Act. So we got an additional $184,000 for fiscal 22. So that combined amount was $20,252,000 in education aid. And we can expect, again, based upon the Student Opportunity Act, that we will be getting $30 per student more each year. That red bar ought to be pretty much the same, $185,000 increase for the upcoming 5 or 6 years under the Student Opportunity Act. So that's state aid. There's additional state aid that's received under some reimbursement programs based upon our actual costs. Again, these have a 1-year lag. I don't budget for these in the school budget because we don't have access to these funds. These are general fund receipts based upon annual expenses. So in fiscal 21, you can see that there's reimbursement for transporting homeless students. And in fiscal 21, we received just over $28,000. That represented 70% of the cost from fiscal 20. So that's a 1-year lag again. And then non-resident vocational reimbursement, that's transporting students to Assabet. We got $13,000. The town got $13,000. That was 6% of the total cost. So, and it varies year by year based upon the legislation, state legislation, legislative process, and how much money they put into those accounts. Grant funding is another important part of our school budget. All school districts receive so-called entitlement grants, and it's targeted funding typically for students with disabilities or low-income students. There's a variety of different formulas that are used to distribute those federal funds equitably across school districts across the nation. The amounts vary a little bit each year based, again, on the federal appropriation process. The money comes from the feds to the state departments of education, and they get to put some of their regulatory rules in place, and then they distribute the funds to Massachusetts public schools. So we typically look at 10 to 12 different entitlement grants every year. And we basically, for simplicity purposes, plan for level funding, meaning whatever we're getting in fiscal 22, we plan that we're going to get the same amount for fiscal 23. And sometimes we get a little bit more, sometimes we get a little bit less, depending on the grant. This is the amount of grant funding that I was just referring to. So this has nothing to do with COVID. Again, you can see, $1.8 million to $2.1 million, kind of up and down a little bit. Again, primarily special education services in Title I reading and math services. So what about COVID? So far, committed to the school district to date since this pandemic onset, just over $4 million in, I think there's about 12 or 13 different grant programs there. Some of them are state, most of them are federal. And the ones in red are the ones that the school department has already expended. That money is gone. And it was used for its intended purposes of managing through all the different logistical concerns of that the pandemic has caused us to change our operations. In blue is some additional COVID funding that have partially expended, and then in red is, in green is the grant programs that we have not used yet, and you can see they have end dates or run out periods going from 2023 to 2024. So we have plans in place to stretch those dollars out to the longest end date possible. Another source of funds for the school department has been tuition and fees that we charge students. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just examples. So the food service program for fiscal 22, I'm planning on a $1.5 million operation. That used to be about a $2 to $2.2 million operation. And that, again, that's self-funded. So all the monies that come in from the fee paying, again, I know students don't have to pay for their lunch this year, but we also get state reimbursement for those meals. Those revenues fund the cafeteria staff and the food expenses. The before and after school program, again, we charge fees for that. Budgeted $1.8 million for fiscal 22. Music lessons is just another example. After school, parents pay the fee for the individual music lessons. We take the money in, and then we pay the money out to the instructors. And just one note here is that our extended day program is running on lower enrollment than expected due to COVID hangover, so to speak. And so we may need to provide some supplementary funding to them at the end of the year. We'll see. It's kind of running very close right now. I'll turn it over to Dr. Sawyer to talk about donations and private grants.
Thanks. And we're going to wrap up with these last couple of slides here. In terms of donation and private grants, this has been something the district's been particularly successful with over the last 5 to 7 years plus. We're averaging on past history, raising about $300,000 a year for innovative programs through programs such as our Colonial Fund. A few years ago, we funded the upgrade of the high school athletic field stadium complex to a synthetic turf field, and that was a $1.8 million project entirely funded privately through grants and sponsorships. And actually in 2020, for these reasons, as well as some other, our partnership with the Shrewsbury Federal Credit Union for the Colonial Connections program, which is a $400,000 sponsorship program. We received a statewide award from the Massachusetts School Business Officials for success in generating private funding to help the school district achieve its goals. The next slide talks about student activity funds. Those of you who have had students go through our schools, and particularly at the high school level, sometimes you have to write a check made out to Shrewsbury Public Schools for some kind of extracurricular activity that might be happening, whether it's a field trip or a dance or a club. Most of this happens at the high school, although there certainly is at every school. And overall, that's about a $500,000 program. Before COVID, it's been a lot lower since because we haven't had as many activities, but those are starting to ramp back up, hopefully, as things evolve. And then this next slide shows you we have a variety of affiliate groups that do a tremendous amount of work to support our schools. Our PTOs, the SSMA, the Shrewsbury Schools Music Theater Association, our athletic boosters and Friends of Shrewsbury Crew, the Shrewsbury Education Foundation. These are all nonprofit organizations that run themselves. They're not under the auspices of the school district, but they're critically important community partners who do a lot of work to fundraise. They maintain their own financial information. That's not our place or responsibility, but we do work closely with them around how their funding can best help the school district.
Okay, a couple of closing notes here, and I suspect that the Finance Committee members know this already, but I know that maybe some members of the community who are watching may not be aware of this. But basically, of course, we're managing, the largest single budget in the town in large sums of money on an annual basis and lots of different sources of funds. I think it's important to know that there are lots of internal controls and separations of duties in place here, just like any other municipal school department arrangement. So, for example, the school department, with the exception of one checkbook for student activities, which is by law allowed for, the school department does not have any bank accounts. The school department doesn't issue checks. The school department doesn't issue payroll checks. We don't pay vendors directly. We prepare warrants. That's this blue box here, just like any other municipal department. We prepare warrants in a bill schedule to prepare all of those things. We prepare payrolls. We prepare warrants of accounts payable to all of our vendors. And then we turn that over to the town accountant's office. The town accountant reviews that and approves it or rejects it. And we get things kicked back to our office routinely, which is great for more information required. And then if it's approved, then it goes over to the town treasurer's office, and it's again separated. And it's the town treasurer, of course, that manages all of the cash, all the incoming cash, all the bank accounts, and makes all the disbursements. So I just thought it was important, given the size of all these funding sources, that people understand that there are adequate internal controls in place. Finally, just a note on our timeline, since we're talking about process. School department budgeting is a lengthy process. We literally start in October of every year with basically kind of baseline stuff around salaries and wages for all of our staff, transportation, and start making estimates. And budgeting, of course, as you know, and just kind of heard earlier from Mr. Mizikar, budgeting is a skill and a science and some luck thrown in terms of estimating. It's an estimating process that we begin every year early, and we try to become as precise as we can. And then we also make recommendations to fulfill the school district strategic goals as set by the school committee. And Dr. Sawyer will make his recommendation in February 16th. You can see here on our calendar. And then we kind of go forward. We'll go forward from there. Typically, we were looking at prior to the override, several months of discussions with lots of anxiety about, what we would be cutting. We know that this fiscal 23 is going to be different in that we have stability and surety about what our budget's going to be. And I think it's going to be a different and much better process. But we'll still have more in-depth discussions about Dr. Sawyer's recommendation with the school committee and do deeper dives on kind of the topics that we just talked about here. Along the way, we get informed about what's happening at the state level with some of the state aid programs. And then, of course, this is all kind of leading up to a school committee vote on the budget that they want to bring to the annual town meeting in May. So that's kind of the timeline. This last piece here is a link, and I don't think I can do it from my computer here, but and I won't take the time to do that. But all of the information that we just showed you is in our annual budget books, and we provide these to the finance committee at the same time that Dr. Sawyer makes his recommendation in February. We provide a detailed budget book. Like this year for fiscal 22, it was like 68-page budget book of everything you want to know and don't want to know about school budgets. So to the new members, you'll be getting one in February for fiscal 23. And then, of course, it gets refined a bit, and we bring a slightly smaller version in the final budget to annual town meeting. And then all of the reports, detailed reports that are provided to the school committee are posted on our website under the Shrewsbury Public Schools website under the budget page. And you can look back for the last 12 years of all the detailed information on school budgets. So there's no shortage of information. I know it's a lot, but that's what we have for you. And I'll turn it over to Mr. Wensky if you'd like to make some closing comments.
Yeah, just briefly, just thank you, Mr. Collins and Dr. Sawyer, and certainly Finance Committee members. As you can see, there's many pieces to the school budget puzzle, if you will. And certainly from a planning perspective, from a budget planning perspective, that override framework that we discussed, is really a game changer. Provides us with greater stability to ensure the success and well-being of our staff and students. So we appreciate the support of the Finance Committee, certainly also the Board of Selectmen, and Town Manager Ms. Zakar for making that a reality. And certainly thank you for having us tonight, and we're happy to take any questions that you have.
Anyone have any questions? Yeah, Rajiv, go ahead.
Yeah, a question for Dr. Sawyer. Dr. Sawyer, when we were discussing about the cost, you also mentioned about spending a few minutes on, again, I don't know exactly how to ask the question, in the sense that if you're spending as we are spending and we are in the lower percentile, how do we do in terms of the education of the kids and in terms of that benchmarking against other communities?
Sure. And there's something that, I mean, there's certainly lots of different measures that we report on each year relative to quality measures. I think that, over time, and this has continued, when you compare student outcomes, whether those are outcomes such as test scores, whether that's state test scores, the MCAS program, or whether those are high school results for AP, formerly known as advanced placement classes, SATs, et cetera, whether that's, and those have always, we've compared very favorably. I think it was 3 different times we've been cited by the National College Board for being an AP nationally recognized district for both increasing access, meaning more students are taking AP courses, with performance either being maintaining or improving performance. In terms of 2 different times, the Center for American Progress did a study of what they termed essentially what was the return on investment that public school districts across the nation were providing. And in both of those studies, Shrewsbury Public Schools were, I believe, in the top 2% of the nation relative to educational outcomes based on the amount spent. I want to be very frank, though. That has been over time, and many times a struggle. Certainly, we focused on our core mission of key academic pieces, but I want to reiterate what Mr. Collins was saying, which is that the willingness of this community to increase their investment in town government and in the school department through the recent operational override is going to make a huge difference, because while our results have been good, we have not been able to provide some of the kinds of programming or supports for students that schools in similar communities to Shrewsbury have been able to provide. And that is something that we're looking forward to over time. Certainly, first and foremost, sustaining what we have and not making cuts, and then reviewing, potentially things that we have cut in over time to either restore or to look at what other kinds of strategic investments might be best made at this point. Of course, we have to look at all of that through the lens of the pandemic. But our community should be very proud that our schools produce excellent results. We do that in a very cost-effective manner, and I'm very pleased that we'll be able to be adding value to those services as we start to invest over time the funds that will be provided through the override.
Thank you.
Anyone else on the Finance Committee? Dennis?
Yeah, I just want to thank you guys for a good, quick preview to what we'll be doing in February and March. Everything, it's very informative. Did have one question. You did mention how the tech schools access is going to be very difficult for people going forward. Are we going to hear anytime soon about a longer range plan of how we can, bring that back or join it? Are we looking at joining a collaborative? I think that's a very important part. And I do know years ago, we sort of took the automotive shop out. We took all the other stuff out of school because we were sending them off to, the tech schools. But I'm just wondering where that is now.
Yeah, let me start, and I'll ask Mr. Collins to talk a little bit about the process of joining a regional technical vocational district. And one thing that, unfortunately, due to the naming, there's two different organizations that often get confused. We are a member of the Assabet Valley Collaborative, which is a group of local school districts that work together to provide. It's an organization, and the different districts are members to provide typically special education programming that individual districts wouldn't really have the scale to provide. Assabet Valley Regional Technical High School is a vocational technical high school with a whole variety of trades and technical fields that they train students in. The vocational technical high school system in Massachusetts, frankly, is the best in the nation. It is one of the great success stories of public education since the education reform law was passed in the early 1990s. There's more demand in the state than there are seats in these schools for understandable reasons, because they provide a wonderful education, especially for students who are looking either to go straight into a technical field after high school graduation, or might be looking to have that kind of hands-on sort of education that then whether they go on to a 2-year or 4-year school after that is going to best meet their needs. In terms of joining a regional district, these districts were created in the 1970s, and at that time, Shrewsbury sent students to Worcester Vocational Technical High School, and I'm imagining didn't really see the need to join a new organization, and it was only over time and more recent last 20 years or so that it shifted to sending kids to Assabet on a tuition basis, and there had always been plenty of seats there to do that. In terms of actually becoming a member, they would have to, the member communities that make up the Assabet High School Regional District would have to consent to that. First off, the school committee that governs Assabet High School itself would have to agree. And it remains to be seen whether they would be interested in bringing on another town, because frankly, one of the reasons that the state regulation changed, I think there were pressure, not necessarily from Assabet, but I think other places in the state, there was pressure from some regional vocational technical districts to give more priority to the students who lived within those communities, who were not only supporting kind of the educational costs, but also the capital costs and retirement costs and those other elements. So those communities may not be interested in giving up seats that they have to another community joining. The flip side of that coin is that, if Shrewsbury were to join that regional technical district, Shrewsbury would become responsible financially for the capital costs, some portion of the capital costs of the big high school renovation that Assabet did a few years back, as well as some of those other kinds of things that you see as a finance committee that are expenses for the town budget, retirement, health insurance, all those elements. And so they might look for a financial partner. Maybe they would be interested in that. But I'll ask Mr. Collins to speak to it. It's not an easy process. It requires the approval of every single town meeting in every single town that is a member of the Assabet region right now, which includes our neighbors in Westboro and Northboro and Southboro, Marlboro, Hudson, Berlin, I believe. Berlin, but not Boylston, correct?
Yeah.
And a couple other towns as well, I believe. But Mr. Collins can speak briefly to some of the technical things that the town would have to go through. And it really would be a town decision, not a school department decision, but a town of Shrewsbury decision.
Yeah, I would just, a couple pieces to add, and I think you hit it pretty good, is that, the Assabet School Committee would, again, by majority vote, have to vote to change what's called their regional agreement, which is an agreement that runs that regional school district. And again, that would be, subject to, their approval. They have a 7-member community, 1 member from each of the member towns. If perchance they decided to move ahead with it, then each of the 7-member communities, Hudson's also a member, and then the city of Marlboro would be up to the city council in Marlboro to all of them affirmatively have to vote yes to allow a new member to change their regional agreement by amendment. So it's a pretty tall task to do that. And if they were to do that, then again, I believe we would probably have to take, if they were to agree to it, then it would be up to Shrewsbury to, I believe, take that question to its town meeting because it would probably be incurring some debt service costs. And so I believe that that would be a Shrewsbury town meeting action, which probably would be the easiest part of the whole equation. I think the hardest part would be, convincing the current 7-member communities that it would be somehow in their benefit that if we were to be joining as a member.
So let me just follow up real quick. My question was more, is there a plan to somehow get these students, be able to service these students, whether it's joining a collaborative would be one thing that I brought up, understanding that it is very difficult. And when you're in a collaborative, you also sort of the whims of the other 6 or 7, 8 towns. If they all vote for something, there's gonna be pressure for us to vote to do those expenses, just like regional school districts. But other ways that we could provide some of that education to these students, maybe through community college, things or something else, but just to give some of these students some of that vocational, whether it be, auto shop, welding, or, a lot of computer science vocation stuff. That's all. I was just wondering if there's a plan that we're going to start putting in place just to think about it, because I do know there was a number of students every year that relied on this, and it seems, with the number of students in other towns increasing, that we probably have an increasing amount of people that would want to get into that type of education.
Sure. Yeah, I can respond to that briefly, Mr. O'Connell, and I appreciate the question. I think that it's not an easy question to answer because it is. I think I want to be very clear. There is really no way that we internally in our school system could replicate the kind of education kids are getting at Assabet. It is so much more intensive. Essentially, for those who don't know, their model is that they go 1 week of academic classes and 1 week in their technical trade shop, so to speak, and they're essentially being trained to be ready to be able to work full time and credentialed in that field by the time they graduate from high school, which is much more intensive than when Shrewsbury High School did many years ago have an auto shop and a wood shop and a metal shop. Those were electives. Students could choose to take, be 1 class a day, for 45, 55 minutes along those lines. That certainly provided some useful skills and they were valuable programs, but ultimately were discontinued because of the inability for the school district to maintain, frankly, the cost without cutting other core areas. But in terms of the idea of internships or partnerships with community colleges, those are things that we're actively looking at. We're looking at right now, Dr. Lizotte, and she's working as acting principal at Patton School, but she's our assistant superintendent for community partnerships and well-being, and she and some others are working intently on expanding our job shadowing and internship program at Shrewsbury High School. And those are the kinds of things that will be very important for students who want to try to find these opportunities. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that we can somehow replicate the model. I know you're not suggesting this, but I think some people have asked that question. Well, if we just built an auto shop back and some things like that, we would not be able to do it at the scale that a technical high school does it. However, there could be some ways to offer opportunities for students who want to look at potentially these kinds of connections outside of what's a more traditional academic program.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your answer. It does sound like your team has already been thinking about this, which is really great to hear. Obviously, it's not an easy thing to do. You can't just build an asset overnight. No one can afford that, but it's good to know we're thinking about it.
All right, thank you. Vikram?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mark. First of all, thank you, Dr. Sawyer and Dr. Collins, for that wonderful presentation. This is my 3rd year running as far as budgets are concerned, and it's always helpful to have presentations like these to connect the dots to understand things better. So my question is basically related to the planning that you basically mentioned in terms of enrollment. So I believe you mentioned that we do hire somebody to sort of get projections in terms of the amount of enrollment that we do have for the general category of students. But what about special education? You did mention that we currently have about 70 students under that program. Was there any way, do we have the ability to project requirements going forward in terms of the number of students so that we can do planning in that, or how does that work? Is it just basically as the need arises, we respond accordingly?
Sure. Let me give a sort of broad piece and ask Mr. Collins to talk specifically about the out-of-district special education projections. But just to be clear, our entire special education program, including all the students who we serve with special needs here within our own schools, is about 1,000 students. And then there's about 70, so it's a much smaller population of students with such intense needs that they need to be educated outside of our school district, and what we call an out-of-district placement. And so, part of our budget process and planning process for our program every year is to be carefully looking at which students might be becoming eligible for services, or students who are already eligible for services who might be needing more intensive services. So even in terms of our staffing here in the school, special education teachers, speech and language pathologists, occupational therapy, physical therapy, a variety of professional level and paraprofessional supports that we have to consider. But for the students who are educated outside of the school district because of the intensity of their needs, Mr. Collins works closely with Meg Belcito, who's our Assistant Superintendent for Student Services, and Meg Bartlett, who's our Assistant Director of Special Education and Student Services, who is in charge of our out-of-district program, to do very careful projections each year because this area of the budget is so sensitive. And maybe Patrick can just speak briefly to some of the approach that you use there.
Sure. I would say that with respect to the smaller cohort of the most intensive students who require out-of-district placement, again, the 70 number, that about 80% of those, are quote unquote kind of stable in their placement. And again, we're responsible from age 3 to age 22. It's really the other, 20% of the existing known students that have some variation. And so we have multiple milestones that we go through during the budget process to check in on the status of those students. In addition to that, there's always a list, and the number on the list varies from 3 to a dozen students every year that are kind of on a so-called watch list, if you will. And that's based upon information from the building-based special education coordinators about how that student is doing at school, and whether or not we're going to be able to sustain that student with the existing services that we have and the existing facilities and some of the limitations that we have in terms of our facilities. So it's constant conversations, but that 20-25% of that 70 number, that's kind of the moving target. That's the volatility. I think the other thing that I know probably many members here are aware, but if a student were to move into Shrewsbury from out of state and come with an educational plan or severe disabilities, we would evaluate that student locally, but it's likely that that student would continue with some sort of out of district placement, and the other state or community that they're coming from doesn't reimburse us, based upon the budget cycle. We just have to absorb that cost. We have to provide services for students that show up. There is some provision in the law that during the year, if a student moves from one Massachusetts community to another, that they would retain financial responsibility, through that continuation of the year. But that's a very kind of limited thing. So that's another area of variability, is people moving from out of state. And so we just have to, absorb those costs, if you will, as they occur.
Thank you. Thank you. No more questions, Mark.
Is there anyone else who'd like to speak on the workshop? Otherwise, we'll hold it off until our budget hearing when that comes up. All right, seeing no takers, that's great. Thank you very much to the school department leaders and to the school committee for joining us tonight and bringing this walk-through workshop on how school financing works. I hope the members of the finance committee learned a lot about it, and I especially hope that the public at home increase their knowledge on how school financing works. So thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to reviewing the meeting schedule. It doesn't look all that complicated. Our next meeting is scheduled for February the 17th. That's not the budget hearings though. Right.
It is not the budget hearing.
That's just our monthly meeting. Right.
It is, but we will have published the first fiscal projection the Friday before that. So we will be able to discuss the preliminary budget.
Splendid. Well, I look forward to that. We also have our 2 budget hearings scheduled for a Thursday, Saturday combo on 24th and the 26th of March. That is not around my kids' school break. And I don't know if the folks who've got kids in the middle schools and actually in the public schools, the February 17th meeting, is that going to be during school vacation? If anyone's got, because sometimes that comes a conflict for folks. And I remember my very first finance committee meeting, we were actually doing budget hearings during school vacation, which was frustrating. I was like on my phone in California or something. Okay. Well, just let us know. I think that should be fine anyhow. So the March 24th and 26th Finance Committee budget hearings are scheduled. And then we do our public hearings. That's also a 1-2 on April 14th and April 28th. I think, let's see. There's no conflicts there, I think. No, that should be fine. So if anyone has no problems with that, we'll go ahead with those meetings. And then do we have town meetings set? Assuming we're doing it per the usual schedule, it's just gonna be the third Monday of May. Is that right?
Well, the Board of Selectmen has flexibility in setting the date because of the changes that we made. So it's either going to start that Monday or be held the Saturday before. Or start the Saturday before.
Okay, that's fine. Do what we got to do. So it's our scheduling. Correspondence is minimal, just an email from Representative Kane about her staffing changes, which I hope you all got a chance to read. Is there nothing else on the agenda? Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Seconded by Carlos. Is there any further it's a non-debatable motion, actually. All in favor, please signify by saying aye when I call your name. Judy Vetter.
Aye.
Lito.
Aye.
Dennis O'Connell.
Aye.
Alan Jarrell.
Aye.
Carlos Garcia.
Aye.
Rajiv Dayal.
Aye.
Vikram Chabra.
Aye.
Mark Adler. Aye. Thank you very much. Motion passes. The meeting is adjourned. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Aye.
Good
Thank
night.
you.